In the city of Genoa, where the mountains meet the Ligurian Sea, the Morandi Bridge was more than concrete and cables. For locals, it was part of their rhythm, a structure you didn't think twice about until the day it disappeared. The Morandi Bridge stretched across the Polsevera Valley like a great concrete spine, linking east to west across the port city. Built in the 1960s during Italy's post-war boom, it was considered a marvel of modern engineering at the time. With its sweeping viaducts and towering pylons, it carried the A10 motorway, one of the main arteries connecting northern Italy to France and the rest of Europe. But by 2018, the bridge no longer looked futuristic. It looked tired. The concrete was stained and streaked with watermarks. Drivers who crossed it daily knew the bumps in the pavement by heart. Trucks rumbled across it at all hours. Commuters merged in and out of traffic as they made their way toward work, schools, and the ports. Beneath it were apartment buildings, train tracks, small industrial warehouses, a neighborhood that lived in the bridge's shadow. Tens of thousands of vehicles crossed it every day. For most residents of Genoa, it was just part of the landscape, an essential but unremarkable structure, high above the city, offering no hint of what would come. But for a smaller circle of engineers and inspectors, the bridge was a subject of growing concern. Since the 1990s, there had been reports about its condition. Small cracks, rusted cables, concrete that no longer bonded properly. Maintenance was carried out, but piecemeal. Budget constraints, jurisdictional confusion, and disputes over responsibility meant that repairs were done in stages, often after long delays. Still, traffic moved as always. The bridge was open. Life went on. In the weeks before the collapse, some locals said they avoided driving over it if they could. There were vibrations that hadn't always been there. Noise that didn't sound right, but nothing official suggested danger. No closures. No urgent warnings. It was summer. August in Italy meant holidays. But not for everyone. On the morning of August 14, 2018, the roads were busy. People were returning from seaside towns, heading toward family, going to work, delivering goods. Some had just stopped for espresso. Others were checking the weather. Storms were forecast. Heavy rain had begun to fall. Among the vehicles on the bridge that morning were families with children, delivery vans, work crews, tourists. A couple on their way to a holiday in France. A young man driving to meet his fiancée. A truck driver hauling fruit southbound. None of them knew they were on the final crossing. It was just after 11:30 a.m. The rain was steady. Visibility was low. The traffic was slow but moving. Below the surface, inside the concrete stays and steel cables, something was giving way. No one saw it coming. The Morandi Bridge was named after its designer, Riccardo Morandi, an Italian civil engineer whose work was bold, innovative, and ahead of its time in the 1950s and 60s. He believed in clean, modern design and in minimizing the visual clutter of infrastructure. With this bridge, he wanted to create something elegant, a long, sweeping viaduct supported by just a few massive concrete piers and anchored by a unique cable stay system embedded inside pre-stressed concrete. At its inauguration in 1967, the bridge was celebrated as a triumph of engineering. It spanned over a kilometer in length and rose 45 meters above the ground, cutting directly through the city's industrial corridor. Genoa, a port city hemmed in by mountains, needed that space. And so the bridge became not just a crossing, but a lifeline, one that carried vehicles over rail yards, factories, apartment blocks, and warehouses. It was the kind of structure that never slept. But the very design that made the Morandi Bridge so striking also made it vulnerable. Unlike other cable-stayed bridges where cables are visible and can be maintained individually, Morandi's design enclosed the supporting cables within the concrete itself. It looked clean. It made the structure appear solid. But it also meant that the most critical components were hidden from view, exposed only when something began to fail. Over the years, problems emerged. By the 1980s, engineers had already begun raising concerns. The materials used in construction, particularly the type of concrete and steel, had aged poorly. Italy's coastal climate, with its salt-laden air and humid summers, had accelerated corrosion. Cracks appeared in the concrete. Rust spread through the embedded rebar. The steel cables, hidden within those massive concrete stays, were corroding slowly but persistently. Repairs were made, but not in full. Sections of the bridge were reinforced. Other parts were left untouched, pending further inspection. Experts warned that the structure was approaching the end of its expected service life. But the bridge remained open. Too important to close. Too difficult to replace. By the 2000s, regular maintenance reports flagged serious concerns. Load limitations were recommended. Weight-bearing capacity was questioned. Some proposed that the bridge be torn down and rebuilt entirely. But budgets were tight, and traffic had only increased. The structure carried an average of 25 million vehicles per year, a mix of commuters, industrial freight, and international travelers. Shutting it down meant rerouting a major artery of northern Italy's infrastructure. Responsibility was also diffuse. The bridge was operated by Autostrade per l'Italia, a private company that managed large portions of the national motorway network under a public concession. That meant oversight was shared between private engineers, government inspectors, regional authorities, and various subcontractors. No single person had full control, and in that confusion, decisions were delayed. In 2014, a university engineering report commissioned by a regional official recommended urgent strengthening of the bridge's concrete stays. It cited visible degradation and the growing risk of structural failure if nothing was done. The report warned that the tension in the cables, critical for holding up the roadway, had reduced over time. The bridge, they said, was living on borrowed time. Yet even then, the response was slow. Maintenance was approved, but not expedited. Strengthening works were scheduled for the future. Proposals for partial reconstruction were circulated, but moved at a bureaucratic pace. Some works began on peripheral parts of the bridge, guardrails, drainage, but not the central span that would eventually collapse. By 2017, pieces of concrete had begun to fall from the underside of the structure. Not large chunks, not enough to trigger panic, but enough to raise alarm. Safety nets were installed underneath parts of the bridge to catch falling debris. For locals living and working below, the nets were a strange sight. Some joked that they wouldn't do much if something serious happened. They weren't wrong. In public, officials insisted the bridge was safe. In internal emails and engineering logs, there was far less certainty. The structure was being monitored. Sensors had been installed. But everyone knew that real rehabilitation would be difficult, expensive, and politically sensitive. And so the bridge remained open. Tens of thousands of cars continued to cross it every day. Drivers looked straight ahead, unaware that the beams and cables beneath their wheels were absorbing weight they were no longer fully built to carry. No sirens sounded. No closures were announced. The most dangerous part of the bridge, a span between two pylons designated as Pillar 9, had been flagged more than once as needing full reinforcement. But on the morning of August 14, 2018, that reinforcement had still not begun. It was just past 11:30 a.m. in Genoa, and the rain had not stopped. It wasn't just a summer drizzle anymore. It had turned heavy, steady, the kind of rainfall that turned roads slick and headlights hazy. Dark clouds hung low over the city, and visibility along the A10 was poor. Still, traffic moved. Slow, cautious, but constant. On the Morandi Bridge, around 35 vehicles were caught in that late morning flow. Cars, trucks, vans, all heading westbound between the towering piers of the central span. It was the work week before Ferragosto, one of Italy's biggest national holidays. People were traveling, some heading to the coast, others home, some just passing through. Among them was a family of 3, returning from vacation. A delivery driver making his 3rd drop of the morning. 2 young men heading to France. A worker en route to his afternoon shift at the port. A couple riding together in silence after an argument. No one knew what was about to happen, not even the people in the buildings below. At 11:36 a.m., a low rumble was heard, not explosive, not sharp, but deep and spreading. Some drivers felt it before they heard it. a vibration through the steering wheel, a shudder in the tires. Then, in seconds, the sound changed. The central span of the bridge, a 210-meter stretch supported by Pillar 9, began to tear away from its anchors. The road deck cracked, tilted, and dropped with terrifying speed. Massive cables snapped like overstretched tendons, sending sections of the roadway into free fall. Concrete pylons fractured under the pressure and collapsed onto the valley below. A 200-meter section of the bridge fell straight down. Vehicles plunged with it, some from as high as 45 meters. Cars hit the rail yards, the riverbed, the roofs of warehouses. One entire truck landed almost vertically, its cabin crushed beyond recognition. Others were buried beneath slabs of concrete and twisted steel. Below the bridge, it was chaos. An industrial building, normally quiet at midday, was suddenly buried beneath thousands of tons of debris. A few workers inside were trapped instantly. Others ran as the walls caved in. One survivor later described it as a noise that swallowed everything. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. Alarms blared. Screams came from somewhere, but it was hard to tell from where. For a few seconds, there was stillness. Shock. And then people began to move. Drivers who had been on the edges of the collapse slammed on their brakes. Some had stopped just meters from the drop, staring ahead at empty space where the road had been seconds earlier. A motorist ran from his car and looked over the edge, then turned away in disbelief. Others began calling emergency services, their voices unsteady, struggling to describe what they had just seen. Within minutes, first responders arrived. Fire crews, ambulances, police. They had no clear idea what they were walking into, only that a major portion of the Morandi Bridge had collapsed and that dozens, maybe hundreds, could be trapped. Rain still fell. Debris was everywhere. The bridge's remains were unstable. Steel groaned overhead. A tower crane nearby had been hit by falling concrete and leaned awkwardly toward the site. Rescue teams moved carefully but urgently. They pulled people from crushed vehicles, some alive, many not. Paramedics set up triage points along the riverbank. Helicopters hovered low, scanning the debris field. Dogs were brought in to search for survivors beneath the rubble. The weight of the concrete made access difficult, even dangerous. Some rescuers worked with hand tools. Others used cranes and diggers to move pieces slowly, floor by floor. Over the next hours, dozens of victims were recovered. Some had died instantly. Others were found alive, but severely injured. A few were rescued from their vehicles with minutes to spare, trapped in twisted metal with rain still pouring through shattered windshields. One man, pulled from a collapsed van, asked the rescuers if the rest of the bridge was still standing. He had no idea how many had fallen with him. Up above, the broken edges of the bridge jutted into the air like open wounds. The remainder of the deck stopped abruptly in midair. Cars were still stuck up there, right at the edge, engines off, doors open. Their occupants had fled. Some had simply frozen. Emergency workers began escorting people off the remaining sections one by one as the structure groaned under its own imbalance. News of the collapse spread fast. Within an hour, the first images began to appear online. Dashcam footage from a nearby truck showed the collapse from a distance. A burst of dust, the sudden vanishing of the road ahead. Photos followed, videos taken by witnesses across the city. The footage was raw, blurry, panicked, but unmistakable. The Morandi Bridge, one of Italy's most important viaducts, had failed in the middle of a working day. By noon, the death toll had begun to rise. Emergency officials warned that it would climb further. Dozens were still missing. Families called hospitals, unsure if their loved ones had been on the bridge. Helicopters flew over the valley, capturing aerial views of the destruction. A vast scar across the city, with buildings sliced in half and cars strewn across the rubble like matchsticks. Nothing about it looked survivable, and yet some had lived. By early afternoon on August 14th, the area beneath the collapsed span of the Morandi Bridge had become a rescue zone unlike anything Genoa had seen in decades. Concrete slabs the size of houses were stacked on top of each other. Vehicles lay crushed beneath the debris, some still recognizable, others flattened completely. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the continuing rain. And somewhere beneath it all, there were still people alive. Hundreds of emergency personnel had arrived. Firefighters from across the region were joined by military units, urban search and rescue teams, and specialized engineers trained to work in unstable environments. The mission was clear but brutal. Locate survivors, stabilize the wreckage, and begin the process of identifying the dead. It was a race against time. Sniffer dogs moved across the ruins with handlers close behind. Cranes began to shift some of the larger slabs. Triage areas were set up around the site, where medics worked under tents and tarps, treating broken bones, head injuries, severe trauma. Helicopters lifted out the most critical patients. Stretchers passed through human chains. Some workers dug with shovels, some with their hands. Any movement in the rubble, a sound, a shift, a muffled voice, stopped everything. Every life mattered. Every minute counted. By the end of the day, dozens had been pulled out, many injured, some miraculously unharmed. Others were not so fortunate. The bodies of drivers and passengers were recovered from crushed cars and trucks, most found in what remained of the warehouse zone below. Their vehicles had dropped from 45 meters. Identification was difficult in some cases, requiring dental records, DNA, or contact with family members who still didn't know what had happened. Not everyone had been on the bridge. Some of the dead had been working in the buildings beneath the structure. Delivery workers, port employees, maintenance staff. They had been inside when tons of debris crashed through the roof without warning. One man was on the phone with his wife when the building collapsed. She later said the line simply went silent. In the hours that followed, Genoa was locked in a state of stunned urgency. The city's main access road had been cut in two. The A10, a critical transport corridor, was now severed. Traffic was redirected through narrow hillside roads and surface streets not built to carry that volume. Residents abandoned their cars and walked. Some stood at balconies overlooking the valley, watching the rescue operation unfold. Hospitals across the city activated mass casualty protocols. Ambulances arrived in a steady stream. Nurses and doctors worked around the clock. In waiting rooms, families gathered with photos and phone numbers, asking the same question again and again. Have you seen this person? The mayor of Genoa, Marco Bucci, arrived on site by early afternoon. So did regional officials and senior police commanders. They described what they were seeing with words like war zone and unthinkable. They asked for calm, for space, for patience. But patience was already running thin, not out of panic, but out of disbelief. By mid-afternoon, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte had declared a state of emergency. The national government mobilized civil protection units. Statements were issued across Europe. Messages of condolence came from France, Germany, the UK. The images of the collapse were now front-page news across the continent. Leaders called it a tragedy not just for Genoa, but for Italy. And for many watching, that was exactly what it was, a national failure laid bare. Social media flooded with video footage. Some was filmed from nearby buildings. Others were from dash cams. One clip showed the exact moment the span collapsed, a wall of mist and debris swallowing the road in an instant. In homes across Italy, people watched the video in silence, then replayed it, not quite believing what they were seeing. In cities like Milan, Rome, and Naples, drivers asked themselves if the bridges they used every day were truly safe. Could it happen elsewhere? Could it happen again? By evening, the death toll had officially risen to over 30. Authorities warned that it would climb further. Dozens were still unaccounted for. The search would continue through the night. Lights were set up across the rubble field. Crews worked in rotating shifts. No one wanted to stop, not while there was still a chance someone was alive beneath the ruins. At a nearby Red Cross station, volunteers handed out water, blankets, and quiet comfort. Some sat with survivors who couldn't speak. Others listened to those who could. A woman who had escaped from a car teetering near the edge of the collapse said she could still hear voices screaming as she ran. A man who had driven over the bridge just 5 minutes before the collapse stared at the ground, saying only, "I don't know why I'm still here." In the city's churches, candles were lit. In hospital rooms, names were whispered. On the streets, people walked slowly, glancing upward, unable to stop looking at the broken edge of the bridge. By nightfall, one thing was clear: this wasn't just a disaster. It was a question no one yet knew how to answer. How did this happen? And why wasn't it stopped? The day after the collapse, the skyline over Genoa was gray again, not just from the clouds, but from the lingering haze that still floated over the Polsevera Valley. Rain had washed away some of the dust, but the destruction beneath the broken bridge remained raw, exposed, and immovable. The rescue operation continued, but the focus had begun to shift. What started as a search for survivors was becoming, hour by hour, a search for the dead. By August 15th, the national holiday of Ferragosto, a list had begun to form, quiet, painful, incomplete. It began not with names, but with questions. A license plate here, a phone call that hadn't been returned, a last GPS signal from a vehicle heading west. Families arrived at hospitals and municipal offices carrying photos and names, some still hoping, others already certain. The work of identifying victims was painstaking and delicate. Bodies were recovered from beneath crushed vehicles, inside collapsed buildings near the riverbed. Some were unrecognizable, others still wore watches, carried passports, ID cards, supermarket receipts. DNA testing began. Forensics teams worked long hours, comparing lists of missing persons to the locations and conditions of the remains. Among the victims were children, grandparents, couples, friends traveling together. Entire families were lost in seconds. One young woman, just 23 years old, was driving to the airport with her boyfriend to catch a flight to Madrid. They had packed their bags the night before and left early to avoid the holiday traffic. Their small red car was found under a slab of concrete, flattened beyond shape. Another victim, a father of two, had been driving a refrigeration truck loaded with produce. He had worked the same route for years. That day, his vehicle was among the first pulled from the wreckage, his body still inside, his phone open to a music app that had kept playing long after the silence fell. There were tourists, too, 3 French nationals who had been on a road trip along the Italian coast. A Polish couple transporting goods across the continent. An Albanian worker making a delivery to a factory just outside the city. The bridge connected more than roads. It linked lives across borders. In its collapse, those connections were shattered. One of the youngest victims was a 9-year-old boy, traveling with his parents. Their vehicle had been located through a GPS ping sent just minutes before the collapse. The car had landed near the rail yard, wedged between 2 containers. All 3 were found together, still inside. Each story added weight to the disaster. Each name gave form to what had, at first, seemed like a structural failure. This was no longer just about a bridge. It was about the ordinary people who trusted that bridge to carry them safely to where they were going. Genoa grieved in public and in private. At Piazza de Ferrari, the city's central square, a makeshift memorial grew rapidly. Bouquets of flowers, handwritten notes, photographs taped to the walls, messages in Italian, English, French, Arabic, all bearing the same themes: disbelief, sorrow, solidarity. Candles were lit and placed in the shape of a bridge that no longer stood. In homes across the city, silence settled. Many residents had known someone lost in the collapse: a neighbor, a classmate's parent, a cousin, a client. It was that kind of city, close-knit, where every tragedy reached more than one family. The official mourning period began. Flags were lowered to half-mast. National media paused regular programming. Television stations aired images of the site over soft piano music. Commentators struggled to describe what had happened without sounding either political or numb. There was nothing poetic about it, just absence, a list that grew by the hour. In the days that followed, funerals began, some private, others public. At one ceremony, 14 caskets were placed side by side in a vast exhibition hall. White flowers, silence. Families gathered close. The President of the Republic, Sergio Mattarella, and other national leaders attended, but most stood in the back. This was not a day for speeches. Many families declined to participate in the state funeral. They said they wanted space. Others made clear they held the state partly responsible and would not mourn under its roof. They buried their loved ones in quiet ceremonies, away from cameras, far from officials. Yet even in grief, some spoke. One mother, her voice breaking, addressed the press directly. "My son did everything right. He was wearing his seatbelt. He was driving carefully. And the road disappeared under him. She didn't want revenge," she said. "Just the truth." That desire echoed everywhere, in churches, in courtrooms, on street corners. People didn't just want to know what happened. They wanted to know why it happened, and why it wasn't prevented. The final death toll was 43 lives lost. Not a number, not a statistic, but 43 separate futures, all cut short on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a moment so fast that most didn't have time to react. As Genoa began to bury its dead, one feeling remained: this should never have happened. As the dust began to settle over the valley, the need for answers surged to the surface, urgent, raw, and unrelenting. This was not a freak accident. That much became clear almost immediately. Bridges don't simply fall on their own. And so, as rescue workers continued their search for victims and survivors, engineers, prosecutors, and political leaders began what would become a massive multi-year process, trying to understand how and why the Morandi Bridge collapsed. The investigations began on multiple fronts. There was the technical analysis, led by engineers and structural experts, aimed at identifying the precise physical failure that triggered the collapse. There was the judicial inquiry, launched by prosecutors in Genoa, focused on possible criminal negligence. And there was the political fallout, fierce, emotional, and public, which dominated national headlines and sent ripples through Italy's government and infrastructure agencies. On August 15th, just one day after the disaster, the Genoa Public Prosecutor's Office officially opened a criminal investigation. The charges under consideration included multiple counts of manslaughter, causing a disaster, and negligence in public works. Within days, authorities had begun collecting documents, maintenance records, email chains, and technical assessments dating back decades. The list of individuals under scrutiny grew rapidly: engineers, company executives, government inspectors, project managers. Every name attached to the bridge's maintenance and oversight came under the spotlight. At the center of the investigation stood Autostrade per l'Italia, ASPI, the private company responsible for managing and maintaining the A10 motorway, including the Morandi Bridge. ASPI was part of the Benetton Group's Atlantia holding, a conglomerate that had acquired a significant portion of Italy's motorway network under privatization efforts in the late 1990s. That privatization had once been hailed as a move toward efficiency. Now it looked like a gamble that had gone horribly wrong. Public anger toward Autostrade exploded. In the days following the collapse, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte stated publicly that the company's concession contracts would be reviewed and possibly revoked. Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio went further, calling for the immediate nationalization of Italy's motorways and accusing the company of profiting while ignoring safety. "If a company makes billions from our roads," he said, "then it has a duty to maintain them. And if it doesn't, it should be stripped of everything." The backlash wasn't just rhetorical. Autostrade's offices were raided by police. Key employees were questioned. Investigators seized hard drives, blueprints, and contractor correspondence. One of the first things prosecutors looked for was whether the company had known, or should have known, that the central span of the bridge was in danger of collapse. The answer slowly became hard to deny. Over the next few months, evidence began to emerge suggesting that warnings had indeed been issued. Structural engineers had repeatedly flagged Pillar 9, the central support for the section that collapsed, as a critical risk. Reports dated back to the early 2000s, describing corrosion, loss of tension in cables, and the need for urgent reinforcement. In 2014, 2015, and again in 2017, inspections had raised alarms about the state of the bridge. Yet the most substantial strengthening works had been postponed, delayed, or conducted in fragmented stages. In one internal report uncovered during the inquiry, engineers had written plainly that the stay cables inside the concrete were seriously degraded and at risk of failure. In another email, dated months before the collapse, a senior autostrade engineer had proposed a plan to reinforce the weakened pylon. The work was approved, but the timeline was stretched. Materials had not yet arrived. The intervention was scheduled to begin later in 2018. It never came. Critics said the entire model was flawed. That profit-driven infrastructure management had allowed essential safety work to be delayed in the name of quarterly earnings. That inspections were too often symbolic, box-checking exercises. That independent oversight had eroded over time, replaced by self-reporting and internal reviews. In short, that the system had not only failed, it had been designed in a way that made failure likely. The political climate became tense. Members of parliament clashed openly. Some called for mass resignations among transport ministry officials. Others warned against scapegoating. But public sentiment was clear. Someone had to be held responsible. Not only because 43 people had died, but because the disaster had exposed a fear that lingered over every Italian highway and overpass. That it could happen again. The tragedy touched a nerve deep within the Italian public consciousness. Italy is a country of bridges, tunnels, and viaducts. Thousands of them built into its hills, valleys, and coastal cliffs. Most of them had been constructed during the mid-20th century, during an era of rapid economic growth and ambitious public works. But now, many of those structures were showing their age. If the Morandi Bridge, once considered a marvel of post-war design, could fall with no warning, what else was at risk? The answer, it turned out, was unsettling. In the wake of the collapse, the Ministry of Infrastructure ordered emergency inspections on hundreds of bridges and overpasses across the country. In some regions, lanes were closed. Load restrictions were imposed. Repair contracts were fast-tracked. The sudden urgency, after years of delay, only deepened public suspicion. It felt like action that had come too late. In Genoa, the mood remained raw. The city was still in shock. Mourning hadn't faded, but it had been joined by something else, a quiet, growing sense of betrayal. People had trusted that bridge. They had built their routines around it, planned their days along its arc. Now, many couldn't bring themselves to drive near the remains. For the survivors and families of the victims, the shift from grief to accountability was personal, not political. They began organizing. They demanded transparency. They asked not just for justice, but for recognition. That the lives lost on that rainy morning were not just casualties of a design flaw or a paperwork delay, but victims of choices. Human decisions, ones that could have gone differently. Prosecutors continued their work quietly, methodically, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become one of the largest trials in modern Italian history. But that was still far away. In the summer and autumn of 2018, the first pieces of truth were just beginning to surface. And with them, the first glimpses of how much trust had already collapsed, long before the concrete ever did. In the months following the collapse, the wound left by the fallen bridge remained wide open, not just in the valley where the central span had crashed down, but across the city and far beyond it. The empty space between Pylon 8 and Pylon 10 became a symbol of loss, not only of human life, but of something less visible, trust. For the people of Genoa, the severed artery was more than a logistical crisis. It was a daily reminder that a structure meant to connect had become a source of rupture. Traffic had to be diverted through narrow, hilly side roads, causing long delays and logistical headaches for businesses, ports, commuters, and residents. Emergency services rerouted. Shipping delays rippled out from the port to the rest of northern Italy. And under all of it was a deep question that still hadn't been answered. What would come next? The city could not afford to wait. The bridge had to be rebuilt. But this time, it wouldn't be left to private firms working behind closed doors. In the aftermath of the collapse, the Italian government made a decision that was as much symbolic as it was practical. The new bridge would be a public work, built with public funds, and carried out under direct state supervision. The choice was deliberate. Italy needed to show that it could rebuild, safely, quickly, and openly. And the man chosen to design the new bridge was one of Genoa's own. Renzo Piano, a world-renowned architect and native of the city, stepped forward within weeks of the disaster and offered to create a new design, without charge. His vision was simple, restrained, and rooted in the memory of what had come before. The new bridge would be strong, sleek, and luminous. A long white structure made of steel and light, with minimal visual noise. It would not imitate the Morandi Bridge, but it would not try to erase it either. Construction began in spring 2019, under an accelerated schedule that reflected not only urgency, but pride. The new bridge would be called Ponte Genova San Giorgio, and it would rise from the same foundations as its predecessor, but without forgetting the weight it now carried. Crews worked day and night. Concrete was poured. Steel beams were lifted into place. Columns rose above the skyline, and slowly, the broken silhouette of the Morandi Bridge gave way to a new shape. Not the same, but familiar. It followed the same line, connecting the same hills, crossing the same valley where the collapse had left scars that still hadn't healed. The construction became a source of national attention. News cameras documented each phase. Workers spoke with quiet seriousness about their role. Engineers checked and rechecked every joint, every cable, every weight calculation. Oversight was constant. This time, nothing would be hidden. The process wasn't just about steel and concrete. It was about showing the people of Genoa and the country that infrastructure could be trusted again. That safety wasn't a secondary concern. That public works could still be carried out with integrity. But rebuilding a bridge is not the same as rebuilding what was lost. The families of the victims followed the construction with mixed emotions. Some saw it as a necessary step forward. Others saw it as too fast, too soon, a distraction from justice still unresolved. There were those who asked, how can we lay new foundations when no one has been held accountable for the old ones? And yet, even the most skeptical couldn't ignore the quiet symbolism of what was taking shape. The new bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was a statement about memory, resilience, and what it means to move forward when the past refuses to let go. On August 3, 2020, less than 2 years after the collapse, the new Ponte Genova San Giorgio was officially inaugurated. The ceremony was solemn, respectful, and tightly choreographed. Flags flew at half-mast. Rain fell softly, just like it had on the day of the collapse. A moment of silence was held for the 43 people who had died. Their names were read out one by one. President Sergio Mattarella and Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte both spoke. But it wasn't a celebration. No applause, no grandiose speeches. It was a moment of restraint, of acknowledgement. The bridge was ready, but the pain hadn't passed. Some families of the victims boycotted the event. Others attended in silence, standing apart. For them, the reopening of the road could not erase what had happened. They were glad the city had a new bridge. But what they wanted most, more than steel, more than structure, was justice. And that had not yet come. The bridge opened to traffic the next day. Cars and trucks returned. The hum of engines moved once again over the Polsevera Valley. But beneath that hum was something else, memory. Drivers crossing the bridge passed 43 lights embedded along the side, one for each life lost. They shine quietly at night, not as beacons, but as reminders. The valley, once filled with rubble and grief, had changed. But nothing about it felt finished. The city was learning how to live with absence, how to build around it, how to keep going without forgetting. The Ponte Genova San Giorgio now spans the gap. It carries commuters, freight, families, strangers. It stands strong, precise, carefully engineered. But even in its strength, it carries weight far beyond its physical load. It carries the knowledge that what fell once should never fall again. Long after the debris had been cleared, the steel raised, and traffic resumed over the new Ponte Genova San Giorgio, there remained one promise that had yet to be fulfilled, the promise of accountability. For the families of the 43 victims, justice was never going to come from concrete or steel. It had to come from names, from faces, from people answering, not in interviews or press releases, but under oath. And so, nearly 4 years after the collapse, the case moved into the courtroom. On July 7, 2022, the trial for the Morandi Bridge collapse officially began in Genoa. It was one of the largest and most complex legal proceedings in modern Italian history. The courtroom had to be specially constructed in a converted warehouse near the port, not only because of the number of defendants and lawyers involved, but to allow space for the public and families of the victims who wished to attend. 59 individuals were indicted, including former and current officials from Autostrade per l'Italia, ASPI, and its maintenance subsidiary SBA Engineering, as well as members of the Ministry of Infrastructure. Alongside them, the companies themselves, ASPI and SBA, stood as legal entities under criminal scrutiny. The charges ranged widely: multiple counts of manslaughter causing a catastrophic event, falsifying safety reports, omission of official duties, and culpable negligence in public service. Prosecutors argued that the collapse had not been sudden or unpredictable. It had been foreseeable, and it had happened because repeated warnings had been ignored, inspections had been falsified, and essential maintenance had been systematically delayed or avoided. The trial unfolded in waves. Court sessions were long and technical. Engineers were called to testify about the degradation of the bridge's internal stay cables, particularly the strali, steel wires encased in concrete, which had corroded over decades without adequate monitoring. Internal memos and email chains were displayed. Many of them showed senior ASPI executives and SBA technicians discussing defects and vulnerabilities. Some documents indicated that reports had been edited to downplay risks. In others, maintenance work was postponed for cost reasons or reclassified to avoid triggering regulatory red flags. One key thread ran through the prosecution's case: that economic pressure had shaped safety decisions, and that in the years leading up to the collapse, profit margins were prioritized over structural integrity. The former CEO of Autostrade, Giovanni Castellucci, became a central figure in the trial. He was charged with having complete awareness of the condition of the bridge and with approving decisions that allowed the risks to remain hidden from regulators. Castellucci denied the charges. Through his legal team, he insisted that he had always acted based on the information provided by engineers and that the collapse was the result of an unforeseeable structural failure, not managerial negligence. The same argument echoed across multiple defense strategies. Lawyers for the defendants portrayed their clients as part of a flawed system, one where responsibility was scattered across bureaucratic layers and regulatory bodies. They said the state shared blame, citing Italy's fragmented oversight mechanisms and the slow, confusing flow of authority between public institutions and private operators. They argued that, while the bridge may have been aging, there had been no clear indication that it was in danger of imminent collapse. But for many watching in the courtroom, especially the families of the victims, that defense felt hollow. These were not abstract debates. They were about real people who had left their homes that morning and never returned. And for those left behind, the emails and reports being read aloud weren't just evidence. They were confirmations of what they had always believed, that someone knew and no one acted. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Some relatives attended every session, taking notes, sitting silently. Others came only on days when specific names were discussed, names tied to the inspections that failed or the approvals that never came. There were moments when tempers flared, but mostly the tone was heavy, restrained, and exhausted. The sheer scale of the trial made it hard to follow. Dozens of defendants, thousands of pages of technical documentation, expert testimony about cable fatigue, corrosion, risk matrices, and load-bearing calculations. But underneath all the engineering jargon was a simple idea. This bridge had not been treated like a lifeline. It had been treated like an asset. One powerful moment came when a former SBA technician admitted, under questioning, that risk assessments had been adjusted in internal systems to appear less urgent. He said he had done so under instruction, fearing professional consequences if he flagged serious issues without management support. It wasn't the only admission of this kind. The prosecution's case took months to lay out. And even as the trial continued, pressure mounted outside the courtroom. Advocacy groups demanded structural reform. The public called for faster legal processes, worried that time, as always, would soften the consequences. By late 2023, the courtroom remained a place of unresolved grief. No verdicts had been handed down. The proceedings were scheduled to stretch well into 2024 and beyond. The law would move slowly. It always had. But for the people who had lost family, friends, or limbs in the collapse, justice was not about how long it took. It was about whether someone would finally be held responsible, not in abstract, symbolic terms, but legally, fully, by name. They didn't want vengeance. They wanted truth in public, in court, and in writing. And more than that, they wanted to ensure that no one ever again would have to bury a loved one because a bridge was too expensive to fix. The collapse of the Morandi Bridge didn't just reshape Genoa, it altered the way Italy thought about itself. Long after the fallen span had been replaced and the headlines had faded, the weight of what happened on August 14, 2018 continued to ripple through policy, engineering, politics, and daily life. What made the impact so deep was not just the scale of the tragedy, but the clarity with which it revealed a national vulnerability, a reliance on infrastructure that was aging, overburdened, and often misunderstood. The bridge had stood as a symbol of progress when it was built. Its fall was a symbol of something else, a warning about what happens when routine maintenance is treated as background noise rather than a matter of life and death. In the years that followed, the Italian state was forced to look in the mirror. One of the first nationwide actions was the commissioning of an urgent review of thousands of bridges, tunnels, and overpasses across the country. Civil engineers, consultants, and government-appointed inspectors were dispatched to assess structures built in the mid-20th century, especially those using similar design principles to the Morandi Bridge, including pre-stressed concrete with internal cable stay systems. The findings were uncomfortable. Many of these structures, once praised for their innovation, had reached or exceeded their expected lifespan. Some had deteriorated in ways not visible from the outside. Others had never been designed to handle modern traffic volumes. The post-war optimism that once shaped Italy's roads had long since met the economic reality of budget cuts, administrative delays, and underfunded public works. In the wake of the collapse, political leaders promised structural change. Laws were passed to centralize control and oversight of infrastructure, aiming to reduce the fragmentation between regional authorities, private concession holders, and national agencies. The government also began the process of revoking and reassessing motorway concessions, most notably targeting Autostrade per l'Italia, the company at the heart of the Morandi disaster. In 2021, under pressure from the public and parliament, the Benetton family's Atlantia group agreed to sell its controlling stake in Autostrade, ending a two-decade era of privatized motorway management. The buyer, a consortium led by Italy's state bank Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, returned majority ownership of one of the country's most critical infrastructure networks to public hands. It was a landmark shift. Not everyone saw it as a perfect solution, but for many it was a clear signal. Private profit could no longer come before public safety. Other changes were less visible, but no less significant. The Ministry of Infrastructure launched new guidelines for structural monitoring, requiring digital records and real-time assessments of key assets. A national database was created to track inspections, repairs, and certifications across thousands of bridges. Universities and engineering institutes developed new protocols for corrosion monitoring, fatigue analysis, and predictive maintenance. Bridge health became a front-page issue, not just after disaster, but during design. But these reforms came with friction. Some municipalities resisted centralization, concerned about losing control over local assets. Others struggled to fund even the most basic safety improvements. In certain cases, local authorities argued they had long raised concerns, but received no funding from Rome to act on them. The lines of blame remained complicated, and not every structure received the attention it deserved. Public opinion, too, had shifted. Where once infrastructure was assumed safe unless proven otherwise, Now the question was reversed. People began asking what material a bridge was made from, who had last inspected it, how old it was. In places like Naples, Florence, and Milan, overpasses were suddenly the focus of citizen groups, local media, and opposition politicians. A sense of watchfulness had taken hold, not paranoia, but vigilance. The engineering profession in Italy also underwent a quiet reckoning. Younger engineers and architects spoke more openly about ethical responsibility. The collapse was studied in classrooms and conferences. New graduates entered the field not with visions of iconic projects, but with the sobering knowledge that their calculations could one day mean the difference between life and death. Morandi had once been a name associated with bold design. Now it also stood as a lesson in limits, of materials, of vision, of maintenance. And yet, despite these efforts, not everything changed. Some promised investments never materialized. Budget discussions returned to familiar cycles. Maintenance projects remained underfunded in certain provinces. Red tape, legal appeals, and slow procurement processes continued to delay safety upgrades. Political priorities shifted, and infrastructure, though still under scrutiny, had to compete with health, migration, and the economy for attention. For the families of the victims, these partial reforms felt like progress in name only. They asked a different kind of question. If what happened in Genoa had truly changed the country, why had it taken so long to start with? Why did it take 43 lives to trigger a shift that experts had been demanding for years? Some remained involved in public campaigns, lending their voices to new initiatives, safety regulations, and victim advocacy networks. Others stepped back, choosing private remembrance over public visibility. But all of them, in their own way, watched the unfolding aftermath not just as citizens, but as people forever marked by the moment the road disappeared beneath their loved ones. Their grief had outlasted the news cycle. Their stories had outlasted the steel beams of the new bridge. And their presence, in courtrooms, in hearings, in meetings with ministers, ensured that the memory of the collapse would not be reduced to a chapter in a textbook or a cautionary tale told after the fact. The legacy of the Morandi Bridge collapse was not just in what fell. It was in what was finally seen and what could no longer be ignored. Behind every news headline, every aerial photograph of the wreckage, every courtroom proceeding and public statement, there were names, and behind those names, lives. The collapse of the Morandi Bridge ended 43 of them in an instant. Dozens more were changed forever. And while the country debated responsibility and engineers studied causes, the people who were closest to the tragedy were living with the aftershocks in ways no law or policy could ever fully address. Some were survivors, physically spared, but mentally caught in the moment the road gave way. One of them was Luigi, a truck driver who had crossed the exact same span just seconds before it collapsed. He'd felt the rain that morning, heard the sudden snap of cables, and seen the edge of the road vanish in his rearview mirror. In interviews, he spoke softly, never dramatizing. He didn't call it a miracle. He just called it a delay. He had braked for traffic, and that brake had saved his life. For weeks afterward, he couldn't sleep through a night. Loud noises startled him. He avoided bridges completely. For someone whose job had always depended on the road, it became a form of quiet exile. Claudia, whose brother died in the collapse, went another direction entirely. She became a voice, not only for her family, but for all the victims. She spoke at press conferences, joined advocacy groups, and attended every court hearing she was allowed into. Her brother had been 28 years old, headed to a job interview in Savona. His car was found beneath a mangled pylon, still intact enough to be identified by the university parking sticker on the windshield. She kept the sticker along with his keys. The rest was returned in silence. She said grief made her sharper. Not angrier, but clearer. In her words, "There's no room for rage when you're trying to make people listen." Some families found themselves divided in how they carried the loss. The Beretti family lost both parents, Sergio and Luisa, who had been on their way to visit their grandchildren. The daughters chose different paths. One focused inward, withdrawing from public life, keeping their parents' memory in the form of recipes, letters, holiday photos. The other became involved in the Technical Oversight Committee monitoring new infrastructure projects in the region. For her, action was the only way to feel connected to what had happened. She said, "If I don't help build what comes next, then all we do is grieve." But even among those who did speak out, there were limits. For Emanuele, whose wife and 9-year-old son both died in the collapse, speaking publicly was never an option. They had been in the car together. He survived, pulled from the wreckage by firefighters, with injuries that kept him in hospital for weeks. By the time he was told his son hadn't made it, the funeral had already been planned. He refused all interviews. He moved out of Genoa entirely. Friends said he changed jobs, rarely left home, and kept no social media. He once sent a letter, unsigned, to a local newspaper, asking only that they stop calling us families of the victims. "We are families. The rest is something we didn't ask for." Others carried the weight in smaller, more visible ways. Some survivors got tattoos, initials, dates, coordinates of the collapse site. Others planted trees or placed commemorative plaques near their homes. A few carried pieces of the bridge, small fragments of concrete retrieved from the site before the area was sealed. It wasn't about symbolism. It was about touch, about holding something that had been part of the moment when their world split in two. Children, too, were shaped by what happened, not only those who lost parents or siblings, but those who grew up nearby. Julia, who was 11 when the bridge fell, used to walk with her grandmother in the park below the span. After the collapse, she refused to go near the valley for over a year. Her mother said she drew the bridge constantly, first broken, then rebuilt. Later, she stopped drawing it altogether. In school, teachers spoke of increased anxiety among students in western Genoa. Sirens triggered panic. Storms made them uneasy. The collapse had marked their geography, but also their emotional vocabulary. And in the neighborhoods below the bridge, working-class districts often overlooked by city planners, the trauma lived in the absence of noise. Many residents remembered the low hum of tires overhead as a kind of background rhythm. After the collapse, it was quiet. Too quiet. The skyline had changed, but so had the soundscape. Some refused to ever call it an accident. They said that word made it sound sudden, unpredictable, unavoidable. For them, it wasn't. It was slow. It was visible. It had been coming. They had seen it in the rust, in the cracks, in the reports buried in bureaucracy. And so they insisted. What happened was not fate. It was failure. But even among the fiercest voices, there was space for grace. In 2022, on the 4th anniversary, a group of survivors and bereaved families gathered privately. No media, no politicians, just a circle of chairs, photographs, and names spoken aloud. There was no agenda. Some cried. Some didn't speak at all. One person stood and simply said, "We remember not because we're stuck. We remember because we still love them." That doesn't stop. Their lives had moved forward, out of necessity, not choice. Jobs had resumed. Birthdays had come and gone. New homes had been found. But the event was not in the past. It was layered into the present, stitched into decisions, anniversaries, routines. For some, healing came in unexpected ways. For others, it hadn't come at all. But they lived, not to represent tragedy, or to explain it, or to fix it. Just to continue, in the shadow of what was lost, and in the stubborn light of what remains. In the years after the Morandi Bridge fell, Italy did what many countries do after a catastrophe. It began to remember. But memory, especially public memory, is not simple. It's never just about the facts. It's about framing, about symbols, about the distance between what is felt and what is told, and who decides what belongs in the telling. In Genoa, remembrance began at the most human level: faces, names, and dates. The first plaque appeared less than a year after the disaster, installed near the base of the new bridge. It listed all 43 victims in alphabetical order, with their ages and hometowns. No explanations, no architectural renderings or timelines, just the people who had been there when the road gave way. But as time passed, remembrance took on many shapes. Each 14th of August, the anniversary of the collapse, the city marked the day with public ceremonies, often understated, always solemn. Families of victims gathered in private first, in churches or homes, away from microphones. Later, officials and local leaders would attend an official commemoration. Bells tolled. The city paused. Some spoke. Others stood in silence. The media returned each year, their reports softer, more reflective. No longer focused on forensic detail, they now framed the story around where we are now, or what has changed. The images were familiar. The valley, the new bridge, the white memorial lights along the span. But underneath the surface, something else was happening. The shift from event to legacy. That shift extended into schools. In Liguria and beyond, the collapse entered the curriculum. Not as a lesson in engineering, but in citizenship. Students learned about the importance of public oversight, about the risks of bureaucratic failure, and about civic responsibility. Some visited the site as part of school trips. Others interviewed survivors or city planners. It was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a case study. Local teachers spoke about how students responded differently than adults. They asked simpler questions. Why didn't they fix it? Who said it was safe? What if it happens again? These weren't political questions. They were moral ones, unfiltered, unguarded, and deeply grounded in common sense. Outside the classroom, the collapse became a reference point in national discourse. Politicians invoked it when debating public investment. News programs cited it during reports on infrastructure or corporate oversight. It became shorthand for preventable failure, the kind of tragedy that reveals not just what broke, but who was supposed to be watching. And yet, like all public memory, it began to change over time. Some feared it would fade, that it would be reduced to a line in a report, a warning sign before the next project, a paragraph in textbooks stripped of emotion. Others feared something else, that it would be instrumentalized, that the story would be used to support political positions, detached from the families who still lived with the consequences. In 2022, the city announced the creation of a permanent memorial park near the site of the collapse. The plan was ambitious but quiet: green space, open sky, paths that traced the old bridge's footprint. No towering statues, no grand gestures, just space to reflect. Some loved the idea. Others hesitated. They wanted to know who would decide what the park would say and what it might leave unsaid, because remembrance is always selective. There were still debates, for instance, about whether to refer to the event as the Morandi tragedy or the Autostrade disaster. Language carried weight. One name centered the structure, the other the system. Words could place the blame on nature, on design, or on decision-making. And each choice shaped how future generations would understand what had happened. At Ponte Genova San Giorgio, drivers now cross a modern bridge, clean lines, white steel, soft lighting. Many never saw the old one. Many are just passing through. But some still look sideways at the 43 small lights along the guardrail, each one marking a life lost. They shine not as warnings, but as witnesses. Artists responded too. Poems were written. Murals were painted. Documentaries were produced. One film followed 3 families through their legal and emotional journeys, showing how grief and justice never move at the same pace. Another focused on the workers who built the new bridge, some of whom had lost friends in the collapse. In art, the story became more than an incident. It became a mirror. And in that mirror, Italians saw more than just Genoa. They saw Naples, Milan, Bologna, cities with their own vulnerable infrastructure, their own political tensions. The collapse became a metaphor for a country that had too often postponed the uncomfortable in favor of the urgent. But not everything faded. Some things stayed sharp. For the families, there was no softening of detail. They remembered not only where their loved ones had been seated, but what song was on the radio, what conversation had been left unfinished. That's the kind of memory that doesn't shift with politics. It doesn't rewrite itself for convenience. It holds steady, sometimes painfully so. And for many citizens, the collapse remained a question mark. What does a country owe its people in terms of safety? In terms of truth? In terms of care that doesn't wait for catastrophe? The answers, if they came at all, came slowly, in laws passed, in bridges rebuilt, in silence respected. But most of all, they came in the decision, made again and again, to remember not just what happened, but what allowed it to happen. By now, the valley below has changed. Where chaos once ruled, order has returned. The new bridge rises cleanly across the sky. White steel, perfect geometry, calculated calm. Traffic moves steadily across it again. From a distance, it looks complete. But to those who remember, the silence beneath the steel is still full. You can stand in the grass where part of the span once landed. There are no scorch marks anymore, no sirens, no cranes, no floodlights. But if you close your eyes, you can still feel what isn't there. A conversation that never finished, a radio left on, a seatbelt fastened that didn't matter. Some absences make noise in their own way. The city has learned to live with it. Not to forget, never that, but to live alongside it. Children who were in primary school when the bridge collapsed now walk past the memorials on their way to high school. They know the number 43 by heart. They've seen the images in class. They've heard their parents speak of that day the same way older generations once spoke of earthquakes or war. Not dramatically, but with a heaviness that never lifts completely. And yet, there is something remarkable in how the city has carried it. Not with bitterness, not with denial, but with a kind of quiet insistence that this was not just an error, that this cannot be a closed case, that safety is not a luxury or a line item in a budget spreadsheet. It is a right. Every month, someone still places flowers at the foot of the memorial wall. Some do it on birthdays. Others do it without saying a word. One man comes every August, wearing a high-visibility vest from the logistics company he used to work for. His brother was one of the drivers lost in the collapse. He stays for exactly 43 minutes every time. Inside homes across Liguria, there are photos that haven't been moved from their spot on the shelf. There are keys hanging on hooks that will never be used again. In drawers, there are still wallets, notebooks, receipts from a holiday never taken. For the families, time does not erase. It rearranges. Some have rebuilt. Some have moved away. Others still live in the same apartments they did before the bridge fell. Windows now looking out onto a different shape, but the same sky. The trial continues. Legal arguments unfold in long, structured language. Technical terms are repeated. Motions are filed. But for those who lived through it, justice is not about the pace of law. It's about whether the truth is spoken clearly, without euphemism, without deflection, without the comfort of calling it an accident when it wasn't. They know that no sentence will bring anyone back, that no conviction, however severe, can restore what was lost. But they also know that naming what happened, fully, truthfully, publicly, is part of what the dead are owed. And beyond the legal, there is the moral. What collapsed in Genoa was not only a bridge. It was a belief, the belief that something so essential, so visible, so critical, would be safe simply because it had to be. That if a road is open, it must be secure. That if a warning is issued, someone will act. That the systems in place exist to protect life, not to outlast accountability. The Morandi collapse destroyed that illusion. And in its place, it left something sobering but honest. The knowledge that safety is not passive. It must be enforced, checked, questioned, maintained not only in steel and cables, but in values, in trust. And trust, once broken, does not rebuild with concrete. It rebuilds with truth, with care, with the willingness to listen when someone says, "This crack should not be here." The new bridge stands. It is solid, beautiful, and strong. But the city beneath it knows what strength really means. It means not allowing this to happen again. Not here. Not anywhere.